everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. All eyes are on Alaska and the high-level meeting with Presidents Trump and Putin. The American president wants a ceasefire. The Russian president wants sanctions relief and more time to make advances in Ukraine. Talking heads have been voicing various opinions throughout the week, with some saying that the meeting will bring no results, while others voice concerns about Trump making a deal with Russia without Ukraine. What is notable about these talks is the size and caliber of the delegations meeting in Alaska. I'd like to underscore that at the time of the recording of this show, the meeting has still not taken place. And before we bring in a guest to talk about this very important meeting that's still upcoming, please take a look at this report from the last week. This may be the most important high-level meeting of the year. At Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage, Donald Trump will try to convince Vladimir Putin to end his war in Ukraine. As the Russian delegation began to arrive in the city, local residents took to the streets to show their support for Ukraine.
This is about Ukraine. It's not about America, and it's not about Russia, really, except that Russia invaded Ukraine, and they need to leave. There's nothing to negotiate.
Ahead of the meeting, Trump said it served as a starting point for organizing an even more significant summit involving President Zelensky, Putin, and himself.
I think President Putin will make peace. I think President Zelensky will make peace. We'll see if they can get along. And if they can, it'll be great.
Russian President Vladimir Putin traveled to the United States with a small army of his top advisors. This included policy aide Yuri Ushakov, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Defense Minister Andriy Belousov, and two finance officials, Minister Anton Sulyanov and Economic Advisor Kirill Dmitriev. The U.S. delegation to Alaska included President Donald Trump, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, CIA Director John Radcliffe, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, and Chief of Staff Susie Wiles. Some analysts say the presence of the Russian president and his delegation on U.S. soil is already a PR win for Putin.
It does, in many respects, at a symbolic level, end his isolation and underline that he's no longer a pariah. So it's a victory for Russia, and it does undermine efforts to hold Russia accountable for the war crimes that have been committed in Ukraine.
But European leaders have welcomed the meeting as a necessary step towards peace during their virtual summit with the United States and Ukrainian presidents on Wednesday.
I think it's completely natural that the United States of America is meeting Russia. That's quite a good thing to calm the climate, and they have a lot of bilateral matters.
Before he returned to his country, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a stop in the United Kingdom on Thursday for a face-to-face meeting with Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
So we stand ready as a coalition.
If a ceasefire is reached, the UK and France are ready to put troops on the ground in Ukraine to safeguard the truce.
But we're ready to support this, including through the plans that we've already drawn up to deploy a reassurance force once hostilities have ceased.
While Poland won't be deploying its own troops, it's ready to serve as a transport hub, as it has been for military equipment for Kyiv for the past 3 years. The government in Warsaw is cautiously optimistic about the Alaska summit, but also wary of Russia's intentions.
For me, the most important thing is that Poland and Europe convince Donald Trump that one can't trust Russia. The only way, and President Zelensky and I said this, is to force Russia into an honest peace.
Do uczciwego pokoju.
The situation on Ukraine's front lines remains difficult. In Donetsk, an area under intense Russian pressure, the situation has been complicated over the past week. Russian forces have broken through Ukrainian lines north of the heavily contested city of Pokrovsk. Ukrainian troops responded swiftly, deploying elite Azov units from the National Guard of Ukraine to seal the breach and halt further advances. For now, it appears they've succeeded, but Russian forces have still managed to cut off key supply routes heading east.
Several small enemy groups, bypassing the positions of Ukrainian defenders, attempted to advance in the direction of the settlement of Zoloty Kolodias. In addition, taking advantage of the features of the local terrain, sabotage groups infiltrated the settlements of Vesele, Vilne, Rubizhne, Kukherivyan. Some of the groups have already been destroyed, the rest are in the process of being eliminated. The situation is difficult and dynamic, however, the defense forces of Ukraine are taking all measures to detect and destroy the enemy groups.
The breach briefly sparked fears that Russian forces might get closer to the fortress cities of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Druskivka, further complicating Ukraine's defense in Donetsk Oblast. Artillery and drone strikes have become a daily reality. More than half of the population has already fled. For those who remain, even basic necessities like water are becoming scarce.
There is constant shelling in Kramatorsk, which means that the water pipes are being destroyed and people don't even have access to utility water. As for drinking water, you can buy it, but it's expensive in the shops.
The governor of Donetsk has ordered evacuations in several frontline towns and villages. While this doesn't yet apply to Kramatorsk, for many residents, the prospect of evacuation is overwhelming.
Where should we go? Who needs us? We are at home. Better at home.
Kramatorsk and neighboring Sloviansk hold immense strategic value. These industrial towns are home to key railway hubs. Capturing them would bring Russia significantly closer to the full control of the Donbass. But for now, they're still under Ukrainian control. And joining us now is our guest, Volodymyr Dubovyk, director at the Center for International Studies. Hello, sir, and thank you so much for coming in and joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you for having me.
Now, unfortunately, we're still before the meeting, and so we don't know what the outcome is. We do know that it's going to be at least 6 hours, according to reports. The high-level delegations and a potential press conference at 1:30 a.m. our time here in Central and Eastern Europe. But I'm going to start off with just the million-dollar question. What are your expectations for this meeting? Based on the evidence that there is this high-level delegations, it will be such a long meeting. Do you think something is already in the oven?
No, I don't think so. I actually think that this would not be the day, regrettably, when the war stops or when the decisions are made that would enable the war to stop. I think it might be one meeting among many others. I think that should be a step in the process. I believe that both sides are not ready to come up with some kind of a peace plan that would be okay to all sides. Ukraine and Russia are still very far away in their understanding of how the war should end. Putin seems very confident in terms of how he continues the war. He believes that his economy and his ability to mobilize more people and throw at Ukraine would actually lead him to more positive results on the battlefront. And he may be not wrong, because Ukraine is having a difficult time withstanding the pressure on the front lines. So at the same time, I think that if Putin maybe thought that he is going to use Trump to deliver Ukraine to him in a way, in quotation marks, maybe he was wrong. Apparently, after all, for several months since Trump returned to the White House, it looked like he is going to pressure Ukraine and the coward Ukraine, and Ukraine would probably be having to agree with what Trump wants. And all the time we heard that Trump thought that Putin actually wants to end the war, and Zelensky and Ukraine is actually the real barrier, the real problem on the hurdle on the way to peace. But then suddenly, a few weeks ago, ago, as we know, the rhetorics in the White House has changed, and now Ukraine receives more weapons from U.S. and also Trump. He decided to pressure Russia instead, or at least he said he will probably. Except that at the moment when we all expected maybe some decisions on new sanctions on Russia, he decided to invite Mr. Putin to Anchorage. So I don't think that would be a breakthrough or major decisions being made in Anchorage. The further events will show, is this an important...
What about this premise that, before we sit down and talk all of these complicated matters and try and get closer, trying to get both sides closer to each other, there needs to be an unconditional ceasefire and the fighting needs to stop.
Right.
Is this the right approach, do you think, to a peace process?
I think it's a logical approach. And actually, from the very beginning, since Trump came back to the White House, Ukraine also didn't necessarily like the idea of comprehensive ceasefire as a starter of the process, because we also wanted to know what would happen later. Okay, so the first step, ceasefire. What happens next with the security guarantees, with maybe peacekeepers in Ukraine, with maybe something else, some security assurances for Ukraine, something like that. But we were not given any, and that led to confrontation in that ominous meeting, in a late February 28th it was, in the White House with Zelensky, when there was a shouting match between Trump and Zelensky, because Zelensky said, Putin is known for violating his word, for violating ceasefires. We know it all along, and tell us what's going to happen next. And Trump didn't like that line of arguing. But then later on in Saudi Arabia, in a meeting in Jeddah, Ukrainian delegation agreed, okay, with American idea, okay, let's do ceasefire, comprehensive ceasefire. And Putin, ever since, he's pushing, he's doing a lot of fog and a lot of confusion. He's basically saying, he's playing mind games. He's saying, I am in favor of this, ceasefire, but here's a list of demands and conditions that Ukraine need to meet before we actually proceed with ceasefire. And in that list, you basically have capitulation of Ukraine, surrender of Ukraine. So that's not good for us, and that's, and that's how it is still. They're confident, they think they're winning, they think that Trump would never really, place so many sanctions on Russia that it would be unbearable for Russian economy to deal with it. And they think that no amount of Western weapons would actually allow Ukraine to recapture initiative in the war. So therefore, he's coming as someone who is supposed to have a diktat, that he would dictate the conditions. It pretty much reminds, really, unfortunately, of the meeting in Munich in 1938, in September, October, on the fate of Czechoslovakia then, when Western leaders actually talked to Hitler and then said, okay, you can have Sudetenland, you can have this region that you want within Czechoslovakia, and President Edvard Beneš was invited only to sign it at the very last moment of the conference. So we hope that it doesn't go that way. We hope that Ukraine will have a say. And I think the Ukraine has cards to play, unlike Mr. Trump often says that Ukraine doesn't have cards to play. And the role of Europe and the role of our international partners, and in particular, one of the major partners is Poland, of course, is a major factor in the situation. Ukraine is not alone.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, not specifically Poland, but just with the European leaders. We had this meeting on Wednesday, President Zelensky going to Berlin. Right. What do you think are the main points that they were able to potentially successfully convey to Donald Trump ahead of this big meeting on Friday?
Right, I think they've done a good job, generally, not just in the last few days preceding the meeting in Anchorage, but also in the previous few months. Ever since Donald Trump came to White House again on January 20th, his second inauguration for the second term, European leaders have been working diligently and very systemically, and comprehensively with Trump, trying to change his thinking. And at some point of time, their coordinated activities in talking to Trump has led to some change in Trump's mind, I think, because all of a sudden he was already, saying things like, oh, maybe if I give too much to Putin prematurely, that would reflect badly on me and my reputation. I would appear weak, and all of a sudden he talks about it, and that Putin is not, he's saying he wants peace, but he doesn't, that he is cheating, that he's trying to manipulate Trump, and we know that he's trying to do that. Oh, of course, that guy is really very experienced in manipulation and mind games and everything think that's his profession, right? So, and he's been doing it for a long time. But anyhow, Trump probably didn't realize that, and then at some point of time he started to begin to realize it, that he is not really looking strong. He's not coming across as a decisive politician, leader of the free world, leader of the greater superpower that is the United States. And the role and actually and the credit goes to European leaders, and Zelensky too, who's talking to Trump from time to time, even though they came through very difficult periods of time. But often Zelensky, when he talks directly to Trump, that actually works. He's also very convincing and good communicator. But primarily Chancellor Merz, I think, and I think Polish leaders as well. Like here is an interesting situation because, of course, you have a government, but you also have a president, and they both can play the role. Like one of the last meetings that they had, collective meetings of Europeans with Trump, it was already President Nawrocki who was representing Poland. But I think there is more or less a consensus here in this country, despite all these discussions about the future of Ukraine-Polish relations. And that's great. And of course, Prime Minister Starmer and of course President Macron and many others, they are the leaders of the process. But if you look across Europe, basically there is a consensus that Ukraine's security is Europe's security. If Ukraine's security is not provided, then Europe is not secure.
There is, but it also seems at the same time that there's also a difficulty with political will in Europe, and of course cohesion, unity, and if sometimes with the European leaders, if they were as sincere, if they put their money where their mouth is, we would have seen, for instance, sanctions enacted against India for importing Russian oil. The U.S. has already done it. It failed to follow through when the deadline came last Friday. But there is the India issue. So I take that as somewhat of an example. Also, how do you think Vladimir Putin benefits from this? I talked to a lot of experts over the weeks, and a lot of people have an opinion or a feeling that Putin is simply trying to buy time to gain more territory in Ukraine. Do you think there are some other motives that Putin has behind engaging in this meeting in Alaska, and how will he play this to his domestic audience?
Well, there's a domestic audience, which is one thing, and that's not the one that he really cares about, because he really tamed that audience a long time ago. They would believe whatever he says. They would project whatever message across the TV screens in Russia, and they would believe it. Most of Russians, at least, would. So he doesn't really necessarily worry, I think, about domestic audience or even his regime survival, for that matter. He is really playing the big international game, where he wants Ukraine and he wants respect, and he wants to be feared and things like that, and he wants to be given his due, as he says, that maybe NATO should step away from Russian borders, something like that. So he wins a few things in Anchorage today. First of all, he's coming out of isolation. He's been in isolation except for certain meetings with certain international leaders, but not with Western leaders for 3.5 years. So I don't think
he seeks to kind of rejoin the international community?
Absolutely. He doesn't like this pariah status at all. He doesn't want to be isolated. He doesn't want to be limited only meeting with Indian, Brazilian or Chinese leaders or Central Asian leaders. No, he wants to be on the same stage with the leader of the free world, with the US president. For both Trump and Putin, this is idea fix. Some kind of manic obsession with this idea that we have two great powers that need to come together and have some kind of a deal, in Trump's words, or agreement. And that's understood by Russians, and that's why they're bringing the team, and they're bringing suggestions about economic cooperation, obviously strategic issues, nuclear weapons related, and so on. So that's important to him. What another thing, he always wanted to decide the fate of Ukraine as one issue among many, above the heads of Ukrainians and Europeans, preferably directly with the US. That's also a nostalgia of thinking from the Cold War times. And he's a Cold War warrior, Putin, of course. He went through Cold War times, and that US decides everything. Sometimes it's wrong, because the US has a big role to play, but it's not dictating anything. It's not a hegemon.
Well, and a great question would be, if Ukrainians and Europeans don't like this deal, then what? Did they go it alone? The Europeans, the Ukrainians say, no, we're going to continue on our path.
They will continue on.
Yeah.
Ukrainians, we will continue on. With Ukrainians it's interesting because every time Ukraine is not agreeing to Russian conditions, some people say, well, apparently you want the war to continue and more deaths in Ukraine and destruction in Ukraine. And of course we don't. No one wants the end of the war more than Ukrainians, obviously, because we are those who are suffering the most. And but at the same time, so there is a sociological poll showing Ukrainians want the peace negotiation. They are okay with negotiating with Russia already, but at the same time, not at any expense. Not at the expense of losing everything and I'm not already talking about fair peace, which would include, for instance, compensations paid by Russia to Ukraine for destruction, or maybe international law actually bringing to justice people who committed war crimes in Ukraine. That is probably behind us. Unfortunately, maybe we'll come back to it at some point of time because we do need fair peace, but at least viable peace that would stand, not some kind of peace in name only, not something that Prime Minister Chamberlain brought from that Munich conference in 1938.
Well,
when he said, I brought you peace for your lifetime. And then little later, like half a year, basically a full year later, there was the Second World War already on. Mm-hmm. So that's what Ukrainians are really worrying, knowing the nature of Putin. And Trump does not know the details and that nature of Putin. He thinks that Putin is a reasonable guy. And he's not already. He's an irrational leader right now. So it's very difficult then. The only way to convince him to stop the war is not to beg him to stop the war, but actually apply pressure on Russia and give more resistance in Ukraine. And when Putin sees that on the ground he's not winning anymore, that he is actually this pro and contra, he is investing more money and lives into this and he's not winning yet, then maybe he would reconsider.
Well, also experts have been saying for years that Vladimir Putin doesn't really have a clear vision of what's actually happening in Ukraine and how successful he really is. Do you think that that's still true? Do you think that his inner circle is feeding him or misinformation to make him a happy dictator?
I think so. And in a way, actually, what happens now in the White House is sometimes similar because they also do that. But with Putin, of course, like with any dictator, any authoritarian figure, who is in power for 25 or even more now years, that definitely happens. But at the same time, what he sees that Russian troops are advancing. They're capturing very slowly, but they're capturing Ukraine's land. Mm-hmm. At the same time, very slowly is important in this sentence because, of course, like they want Donbass, for instance. That was the primary reason for them to go into Ukraine, to capture Donbass region. What happens now, 3.5 years later, they still don't have control over Donbass. So they're trying via negotiation, actually, to demand that Ukrainian troops would withdraw from Donbass and some other regions so that Russians could actually finally capture the region of Donbass. So that's something you need to have in mind, this picture. On the one hand, Russia has an initiative and they're pushing along the entire front line. On the other hand, it's very slow movement, and it costs them a lot, right? And Ukraine is not losing, it's not in critical position. Ukraine does not think that we are in critical position to the extent that we would consider, surrender or capitulation. So that's why I think this is not a situation where Ukraine would say, okay, if Trump and Putin agreed, we have to agree. No, we have cards to play. And some of those cards are dealing with Europe because since Trump came back to White House, Europe suddenly understood that we are between aggressive Russia on one hand and sometimes unpredictable, and volatile US on the other hand. So we need to get our act together and spend more money and be more serious about our own security. And Ukraine is part of European security. So we're seeing Europe doing much more. There is a coalition of willing certain countries that are giving to Ukraine a lot of financial assistance, weapons, diplomatic assistance. This is not security guarantees that maybe Ukrainians would prefer to have, like boots on the ground. Finally, will you send some troops to fight against Russians with us? No, that's not going to happen. No one wants to have in NATO direct confrontation with Russia. Or maybe you can close the sky. Maybe you can use some weapons like missiles from this country of Poland or some other countries that would be downing Russian missiles over Ukraine.
I've suggested that many times
to
many officials.
A lot of people did. It's not going forward. Yeah. So now we're realistic. We think that, okay, if we can't do all of that we've just mentioned, at least you are giving us some weapons and technologies, and you're working with us, many countries investing in producing more weapons in Ukraine, actually, which makes sense because you pay much less to the people working in the factories, and it's very close to the front line, so you actually can very quickly deliver weapons to the front line. There is a drone production. There's a different type of warfare that we're having. Of course, tanks and artillery and everything still, means a lot. But at the same time, drones. It's army of drones on both sides. So, so whoever prevails in using this modern technology is actually going to be winning the war.
I think Ukraine's producing the most amount of drones in Europe right
absolutely.
now.
And we can now actually share some of them and some of the technologies with other countries, including US.
Yeah, which absolutely should be done. Now, also in these meetings, I imagine with the size of this delegation and bringing someone like the Treasury Secretary, they're going to talk about sanctions relief. We've heard some rumors about Alaska maybe being opened up for the exploitation of rare earths by Russia. I don't know if that's seriously on the table or not. But are there some, I guess, carrots that can be put out there for Russia to get to this ceasefire? Well, and what is the red line? What's acceptable and what's unacceptable?
Well, I think, of course, I'm very skeptical about this, inviting Russia to do exploration of natural resources of Alaska. For many reasons. Well, one of them is actually that Alaska has been pretty much a reserved, untouched land for a long time.
I think this would be a national security major issue.
Yeah. So I think the Trump would have a major backlash in Washington if he actually seriously tries to walk that road. The major carrot would be, if you're US and Trump, that, okay, we're not going to apply bone-crushing sanctions against Russia right now. If you show to us some signs that you're willing to go towards peace. All right, maybe a ceasefire, maybe something. Russians trying to counter the idea of comprehensive ceasefire with partial ceasefire, only the aerial ceasefire, so no Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities with drones and missiles, and therefore Ukraine is not attacking any infrastructure facilities in Russia. So they're trying to counter that suggestion. But clearly, it was really strange to me when this information about the Alaska resources was mentioned in the press. Like, well, who needs to do concessions here? Putin does. Why is the U.S. trying to lure him in and do some concessions and interest him with some things, like the exploration of resources in Alaska? So that's really strange. Trump needs to remind himself, some people need to remind him that he is a leader of free world. He is a powerful politician who has some still resources and some levers, in his hands. And if he wants to end this war, the only way is to press actually Russia. Because Ukrainians would continue fighting. Like in the previous few months, since Trump came back to White House, it was looking like Ukrainians would probably be fighting against Russia even without any American support. And even then, Ukrainians didn't lose immediately, And now, when Trump is actually giving new weapons to Ukraine, it's even less over some kind of option in the future where Ukraine loses quickly. So, yeah, we need to see President Trump being pragmatic and being rational, understanding that the role of the United States here is huge, understanding that if he somehow loses Ukraine, that would be a major debacle for history of U.S. foreign policy for many decades. Like he was criticizing Biden for withdrawing in 2021 from Afghanistan, but losing Ukraine would be making losing Afghanistan really a small token.
Yeah. Absolutely. Final question here, because we're almost out of time. The front lines and what we saw this week near Dobropilya, we saw these Russian sabotage and infiltration groups break through the line, catch about 16K of territory. We don't know the numbers. We don't have satellite pictures for some strange reason. So what are your thoughts on this? Is this a dangerous situation, or do you think this will be mopped up and it was just a simple failure at that section of the front line?
Look, it is in itself a small failure. It's a minor issue. It's still not a huge breakthrough. But it is a symptom of a bigger problem that Ukraine has. Yes, we are overstretched. We have problems with some types of weapons. We have problems with, a number of people, in arms at our front line. This is not a big secret. Russians outnumber vastly Ukrainians, and that's what I say that this is an asymmetric war. It was one and it remains one. Russia is just bigger in any respect. You have natural resources, nuclear weapons, but also bigger population, also a authoritarian country where it's much easier for them to actually say, you go to front line. And more money to pay to those people who go to front line, unlike Ukraine. Ukraine's economy is in ruins, so we're only surviving as an economy thanks to the assistance we're getting from abroad. With Russia, it's a different situation. They still have this, golden shower, a lot of money coming to Russian economy because they still sell a lot of stuff around the world. So we need to actually apply pressure on that front, quotation marks, where Russia is getting its money to pay for their war machine. And that's what needs to be addressed. And that's why I think if you're serious about applying sanctions, especially secondary sanctions, it can actually hurt Russia where it hurts.
Yeah, and you have to deal with the countries that are supplying Russia with these things. Well, sir, Volodymyr Dubovyk, Director at the Center for International Studies, thank you so much for joining us today. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you then. Goodbye.